Mr. Steve Maximay is an unofficial member of the Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies. He contributed to the Caribbean World of Work Forum since its inception. He is recognized, he's a recognized expert in the field of climate change, development, and agriculture. His expertise allowed him the privilege to work in every CARICOM country. Mr. Maxime is committed to just transition in the agriculture sector in small island developing states. Permit me to welcome Mr. Steve Maxime to deliver his presentation.
Thank you very much. Good morning, all, here in live audience and online. I have a story to tell. I was elated when I looked at the program and saw that I was going to be the opening bat for such a distinguished team. Let me first apologize to our colleagues, our CARICOM colleagues in the Bahamas, Suriname, and Belize, who may not catch this cricket reference. So I'm here, all doused up. I was hoping that those of you online would be able to see my sartorial elegance, because I thought I was going to be opening the batting, only to be told by Dr. Henry, the esteemed director of this college, that I'm not really the opening bat. I'm really the night watchman. This is the person you put on after a break, like we had a break this morning. So whilst everybody else is having coffee and the people online are watering their plants and so, they gave me 15 minutes to do my thing, which is what I'm going to proceed to do now. So having been devalued and not being considered an opening bat, I didn't even have time to do presentations because they said, you're only here as a stand-in until the real audience turns up and until we hear from my esteemed colleagues, Frank and Spencer. But to be quite serious, what I saw when I looked at the overall program for this week, Caribbean World of Work Forum, was a central theme, and it was explored fully this morning. The central theme I saw was social justice. I looked at the program, and you had resilience, transformation, sustainability. And when I look at RTS, RTS is the most common abbreviation for rights. And I'm thinking, we are talking about rights. And those rights that are espousing resilience, transformation, and sustainability, that's RTS, are countervailed by responsibilities, because there can be no right without a responsibility. And I see those rights and responsibilities as different sides of the same coin, the same social justice coin. And I want to begin my little interlude whilst the audience returns and people come back from having their coffee online and so, to talk about this thread of social justice, but in terms of climate justice, which is something I know a little bit about. So I'm thinking that we have heard so much about grassroots efforts and the whole concept of cooperatives, CSOs, etc. And I'm proud to be an advisor to a number of community groups, community organizations, and we have been able to literally explore this concept of climate justice. To be able to appreciate climate justice within the rubric of all the social justice that we heard about this morning and for the last 2 days, you have to think in terms of, what is this justice thing about? What is this climate justice thing about? And I've recognized over the years 4 interpretations of climate justice. There's a procedural one, there's a distributive one, there's a restorative one, and there's a retributive one. Now, if I were a genuine presenter, and if Andre hadn't curtailed my presentation, I would have had slides, I'd be able to look up at them and, and pronounce and so on. But since I'm only the night watchman, I'll have to do them off the top of my head. So when we talk about procedural justice, we are talking about ramifications that come out of the actual procedures. When we talk about restorative justice, we're thinking about making things right, and you heard a lot about that this morning, by restoring things to the previous state. Then there's a retributive type justice, which deals with punishment, carbon taxation and that type of thing, because we recognize that you are part of a problem, you are the perpetrator, this is how we are going to punish you. So there's the procedural, there's the distributive, in which we determine who gets what. And in a different setting, if we are talking in a different forum, I would have gone into each of those specifics. But suffice it to say that we know, as SIDS, as Caribbean people, that we are being we have been the victims of this climate crisis. And that in a just world, where justice principles apply, we should be in line for some form of compensation, whether it is through procedural routes, retributive routes, restorative routes, or distributive routes. So having said that, when we look at the world of work and how we are going to get these social justice instruments, organizations, the community groups, how are we going to get them to fund the just transition of our sectors? And as my expertise is particularly in the agricultural sector, and I'm just going to do a cheap plug for the food sovereignty session after lunch. So if you want to hear me expound on that particularly, that is where I'll be doing that. But in a more general sense, when we talk about justice and a just transition, and I want to recommend highly to not just the audience here, but the audience online, to go and take a look at the recording of the Just Transition session done by Ozzy and Ian yesterday. Was it yesterday, Spence? Yesterday. Because I think they captured this whole concept of a just transition. And most importantly, when we say a just transition, we are using just as an adjective, not an adverb. When we say a just transition, we are talking about a transition that is morally correct, legally grounded, and it has the essence of righteousness to it. It is a transition that is not forced on you. And a lot of these adaptations and mitigation efforts tend to be forced on us. We are talking about a just transition, one where we have the moral authority to make that transition on our own accord, by our own rules, by our own indigenous and local mechanisms. And these are found in a range of social organizations, as the topic says, from grassroots to all kinds of community organizations. So that just in the transition is just as an adjective, not as an adverb, not meaning simply or only, because then you would end up in the Nike realm, where the metropoles and people in the global north are telling us to just transition. I mean, let's go ahead and transition. What is all this old talk about, you know? Because it's just simply transition. And as I said, I recommend again highly that contribution made by Ozzy and Ian a couple days ago, if you want to get a feel for this just transition. But what does all of this have to do with SSC? What does all of this have to do with a social, and solidarity economy? I'm suggesting that our concern for indigenous peoples, for disadvantaged groups, have to be grounded in our ability to make investments. None of the community groups I advise or I'm connected with ever mention the word donations. We are looking for investments. We are looking for people to invest in our mission, to invest in our vision of the future, to invest in our vision of what an enhanced, developed community can be like within a social justice construct. So that these investments are not cap-in-hand type donations. They are based on our awards, our climate reparations, that come disguised via the GCF as part of our bankable NDCs, et cetera, and how do we then take those funds and craft an economy that is not solely based on profit, but is based on principles of equity, all of the glorious things that you will find out about from my two esteemed colleagues who have full presentation times, unlike my 15 minutes, but we'll take that up another time. So that these community groups, I see them investing in intellectual property. This is something that hasn't been mentioned, not at any of the sessions that I've been to. I think we do ourselves a disservice when we talk about indigenous communities, when we talk about local knowledge, traditional knowledge, when we ignore our abilities to brand, to own, and to, yes, monetize some of our intellectual property. And I'm standing here looking at some fairly blank faces in the audience because where did this intellectual property thing come from out of the blue? But I've been a major advocate. I've been lucky enough to be one of the members of the cabinet-appointed committee that wrote the intellectual property policy for Trinidad and Tobago. And I conducted the first intellectual property strategy for Trinidad and Tobago. And I can tell you that we are all missing a step when we ignore the real strength of our social and solidarity economy, which has to do with our brain power. Because when land space is limited, head space has to be expanded. We ought not to be concerning ourselves with running down a whole range of commodities and so. We have the potential, we have the power, the brain power to craft creative and other types of solutions. Right now in the audience is a colleague of mine who is making waves in the fashion industry using renewables and recyclables, etc. And these are the kinds of investments we want for this SSE economy. We want to be able to craft solutions that are born out of our strengths, not out of other people's weaknesses, or other people's strengths, sorry. And it was interesting this morning when we heard mention of industrialization by invitation. And all it was in another context. I want to assure you that within the climate crisis framework, what I've been advising community groups, civil society organizations, and NGOs to do is to harness, literally harness, the big Rio Trio, what I refer to as the Rio Trio, the big 3 UN conventions, the UNCCD, the UNFCCC, and the UNCBD, namely United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification and Drought, and the United Nations Convention that deals with biodiversity, the Convention on Biodiversity, CBD. And I can tell you that within the construct of an SSE, there are organizations out there within the Caribbean that have been harnessing investments, notice I didn't say donations, investments coming out of those 3 UN conventions. And I am personally involved, so I'm not just telling tales out of school. I'm telling you that there are support mechanisms there where you can grow an economy sector by sector. Although my expertise is within the agriculture sector, within all sectors where you harness investments from those big 3 Rio conventions and you craft, using the intellectual power, you craft economies, ways of operating that are uniquely ours, that are Caribbean in scope, so that some of my work with the guy Funa in Belize, or the Guayaka in Guyana, we are talking about crafting branded products and procedures that conform to an SSE, that do not use the same rubric or the same measurements as you have with the more traditional capitalistic type economic pursuits. So that as a precursor, as the night watchman, as the person who is preparing the context and the pitch for my two esteemed colleagues, Spence and Frank, I want you to know that there is a wider scope within which we can look at grassroots support in this so-called green economy, or what I refer to as the cyan economy, because although we are small island developing states, we are really large ocean states. So that you talk about the blue and green economy and how do we invest in those economies. We invest in them by sticking to the construct of this entire week, which is based on social justice, but the particular aspect of it that I am interested in is climate justice. And I already hinted at the 4 areas or interpretations of climate justice: the procedural, the distributive, you see, if I had my slides, if I wasn't constrained, I don't have to be putting some up in my head. So we are talking about the procedural, the distributive, the retributive, and the restorative. So that when you pick out of those frameworks, how do you then craft a social and solidarity economy out of it? And true to form, I have used exactly my 50 minutes. I thank you very much.